Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here on this yet another drizzly day in Washington, D.C. When I came in, I think they had the clue because there was rainwater on my glasses, and somebody said, "Oh, is it raining outside?" And I said, "Well, only when I would go out in the street and try to hail a cab, and then it would come down in sheets, and then I'd go back." For those of you who are from out of town, I've lost count of how many days of rain, but someone else was remarking that for the first day in a long time, they left their umbrella at home, as one of our speakers, and we won't do that for a while. I'm Frank Farrow. And it is my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Center for the Study of Social Policy and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, both of whom are sponsoring this event. And for us, for others, and I think for you by the end of the day, this is a very happy event. We are here to celebrate the publication of a new book. If you haven't seen it, you will shortly. Integrating the Inner City, the Promise and Perils of Public Housing Transformation, Mixed Income Public Housing Transformation. And it is an honor to be able to help launch the book into the world. It's, I think, going to be an important book, and we'll talk about that as we go through the afternoon. The authors are two people that I've admired for a long time. Rob Chaskin from the University of Chicago and Mark Joseph from Case Western Reserve University. And as you will discover from hearing them talk, and some of you know them already, they are scholars. They are people who are deeply committed to the public policy implications of their work. And I suspect for at least the last couple of months when the book has come out, they feel a little like, or should, like proud parents. And we're here to further send their, I won't carry this analogy too far because I will get in trouble, but their child into the world. But in addition to celebrating, and that will be part of what we do, we'll go back to the reception after we have some very good discussion. In addition to celebrating, we have structured this next hour or so as an opportunity to learn, because the subject of mixed income public housing transformation means a lot to a lot of the people here. I was delighted to see how many people from the administration had signed up for this event. I recognize some of you. I don't know who all of you are, but hopefully we'll get a chance to talk during the reception. But the leadership of this administration in this space has been really exceptional. And so I won't call out even the people I recognize here, but thank you for that leadership and thank you for being here. We also have housing advocates, we have developers here, we have people from communities, we have people from county agencies who are working on this agenda. We have in the room a lot of expertise, and we're going to use that as part of a discussion this afternoon about mixed income public housing transformation. Let me tell you how we have structured the time. We are first very, very fortunate to have Catherine O'Regan with us, who is Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD. And I knew of Kathy's work at HUD, but I had not realized the extent of her scholarship before coming to HUD, and I suspect into the future. A very distinguished scholar in her own right at New York University's Wagner School of Public Service. So there couldn't be anyone who better to frame the context, to talk a little bit about what has been happening prior to this administration, with this administration, and where the book that Rob and Mark will talk about fits in that spectrum of thought. We're then going to we'll hear from the authors, and Ryan Chow, who is Vice President at the Casey Foundation for Civic Sites and Community Change. He oversees a lot of the place-based work that the Casey Foundation does, is going to interview Rob and Mark and then open it up for broader conversation. So I would encourage you, as you're listening, to jot notes, or type into your phone, do whatever you do to remember the questions you have, because we will have a chance for you to pose those and to get into a dialogue. Our communications director at CSSP, DeQuendra Neely-Bertrand, and thank you, DQ, for all the work you've done on this, and I'll say some other thank yous as we close, has asked me to encourage people to tweet about this, to be on Twitter about this. The hashtag is integrating the inner city. DQ knew that this was not my forte, so she gave me very explicit notes. I'm surprised she didn't write them on my hand or my forehead. But we encourage you to do that and share the information about the book, about this discussion. I think what this book is for us at CSSP, and I know for the Casey Foundation, we are committed, as I suspect everybody in the room is, to contributing from our vantage point in any way we can to building healthy, thriving, more equitable communities. And the book, the research, the authors and who they are and what they've done, certainly Assistant Secretary O'Regan, are all about that, and that's the conversation we'll now get into. So, Kathy, I will turn it over to you.
That's a big mic. Okay. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Mark and Rob and Annie Casey and CSSP for hosting this and inviting me. The starting point, I'm going to start where you started, which is thinking about the importance of this topic for the administration and the focus this administration has had on mixed income communities, on improving public housing, and coming up with alternative mechanisms for driving that. It is a work in progress, which I think is going to be a theme throughout, so I'm going to start with that. And I've been focusing my work on this long before coming to HUD. I actually did my dissertation on areas of concentrated poverty and their effects. And so I'm thrilled to be here in multiple hats. And one of the hats I'm wearing here is as the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research. So the lens I'm taking to the framing remarks are not to summarize the book, because the panel is going to take you through a dialogue about components in the book, but to really think about the thoughts it inspired for me when I'm thinking very much about how we learn from policy, how policy moves, and specifically thinking about research informing policy. And so if the real thrust of the book is talking about using specifically Chicago's transformation plan as a way of seeing the experience on the ground of using mixed income public housing developments as both the revitalization tool and an integration tool. And I want to hold that way of framing it and thinking about it. There's more in the book. It's a very rich book. But I want to hold those pieces because it holds two things that are pretty important. It's about revitalizing poor neighborhoods and those neighborhoods becoming economically integrated. This is about economic integration. So both of those connect to a priority of decreasing concentration of poverty, right? Which is about our core of theme in this administration. And it's the punchline of the book is it's really hard to do. Complicated answer, really hard to do. I'm going to frame most of my remarks on the first part of thinking about that over the course of time. The book starts by placing the plan in pre-existing policy and context, national context of what's going on, how we got there, and then a policy context over time. So it basically draws what I thought of as a policy arc And if you'll tolerate the way that I tend to think, I'm very visual. I have a map in my office. I wrote a scheme, a timeline scheme that covers the time period they're covering right before and where we are now. And I had thoughts that really have to do with the first part of this, which is my main comments, which is how policy evolves, and then some reactions, which are more queries or immediate reactions given where I'm sitting. So we're starting out in late 80s, early 1990s. We've had multiple decades of poverty concentration in the country, and we're at a time where there actually is concerted concern about three things. One is the effect of areas of concentrated poverty on those who live in those communities and the communities themselves. The second is the role of public housing in possibly contributing to concentrated poverty. And then the third is a recognition of the conditions in the public housing in many of these highly concentrated areas. So there were three parts of a conversation starting. There was a commission report, then Hope 6 started. Hope 6 started focusing on the third. So we're here. Hope 6 gets started a couple of years later, primarily at the start with a focus on the distressed public housing. Policies move and change and learn. Within a couple of years, the goals expanded to consider all of those goals. By 2000, when the plan, Chicago's transformation plan, was coming in, it had embraced this model where it was mixed incomes developments themselves that were part of the revitalization plan, revitalizing the neighborhoods and leading to integration. And so the authors, when it comes to the perils and challenges part, focus a lot on that second goal, integration. My first gut reaction, and I realize this may be my position at HUD, was, but there were wins here. We actually saw physical transformation. We saw changes in those neighborhoods. We saw dramatic decreases in crime. And when you think about where we were when this started, this was a major goal. If you think about where we are still in this country, still a major goal. But another point to that is programs with a multiplicity of goals are complicated. You may win on some goals and not on others. And so they're complicated stories to tell. Hope 6 still going along in the background, continues past 2000. We have criticisms and concerns about who wins when you get those physical developments. Are the original residents actually the winners? So kind of point 2. Multiplicity of goals. Sometimes those goals can be in conflict, or you emphasize one and there's a trade-off on another. And so it does make for very complicated talking about how well things worked. Some of the other criticisms that came along were top-down, no voice of residents early on, too narrow a focus only on public housing, too narrow a focus only on housing. That evolved. As we're going through, you're going to see changes. If you did a mapping of the projects that came in online in Hope 6 at different times, and I hear we're closing out the last one, you would get a different focus on what they look like. In 2011 is when choice neighborhoods, HUD, this administration's current evolution of where we're going, was created and had a different structure in the way that it was set up. And so my third reaction as I'm reading in the book on a collection of things, I'm thinking, And so what would they say about choice in the context of this? And so I think that's one of the conversations we'll have up here with the panel. I was asking Mark about the next book, so in my mind, 5 years from now, if you're following our choice neighborhoods, how much of the perils would have actually been resolved? What are the things you can tell us now in the way we're doing choice that you think from what you're seeing on the ground are missing? Because choice will then be its own evolving policy as we go along. So those are things I thought of that were directly related. I now have 2 offshoots, less directly related, but I was thinking about them from the book, so I'm going to bring them into this. And this first one is a little bit of a hobby horse. At the beginning of the book, there's a prologue that contains a series of quotes with interviews from homeowners and the public housing residents who have moved back in the same development. And those exchanges are very powerful and teach you the kinds of things that you don't learn from quantitative work, and even not necessarily all qualitative work. It was kind of the juxtaposition and then almost a reversal of what they were saying when I read the next theme. So my theme here is thinking about how it is we can improve research so that it better informs policy. There's a naive social science version of research, particularly when you're looking at interventions, which is you ask the question, did it work? It's an all or nothing question. It's an up or down. It's kind of if it works, we fund it. If it doesn't work, we don't fund it. This is almost a minimalist way to learn, right? We learn maybe one thing, particularly if it's multifaceted. It's not even complete. And it doesn't permit us to do what we do in the policy realm, which is we evolve, right? In general, you're evolving. And so this book is the opposite of that. It is multifaceted. It takes multiple theoretical lenses. It uses quantitative, qualitative data. It studies for, depending who you talk to, it's a 6-year or a 9-year book, 6 years at least in the field. And we miss that in the way that we frame some of our work. I would say some of the insights I got from that part of the book likened to Matt Desmond's Evicted, Coming of Age in the Other America, all of which are getting a lot of play at HUD. We are reading those pieces for thinking about design features. And so while it's a very time-consuming type of research, it's a much more policy-relevant type of research. And learning the most from the research we do may mean applying lessons beyond what is studied directly. And so that's my last point. I'm hoping we can learn something from this work outside of intentional integration. So the authors are talking about intentional integration, about mixed income developments in the footprint of the pre-existing public housing community. So by the structure of the design of the units and the income composition of what you would do, including home ownership, you've basically forced economic integration. But I'm hearing echoes of exactly the same tone and fears and issues in neighborhoods that are rapidly gentrifying. So you go and you hear the us versus them language. You hear long-term residents saying, I don't see myself in this. And Derek Kyrick was talking about some changes in communities where the middle group may be the one that's most at risk for displacement and moving. That's your buffer group. And it means you're left with very big social distance that you talked about in these neighborhoods. And this is going on now. And if we don't grapple with how to capture that diversity as it's happening so we maintain inclusive communities, we'll be missing something. And I think that what you're learning in these intentionally integrating places has lessons for where this is happening without intent, but at a kind of similar speed. And so I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all to tell us about the book.
Thank you very much. I'll ask the panel to come up and get mic'd. I will introduce again, because Ryan, they may not have realized who you were. Ryan Chow, Vice President at the Casey Foundation. I thought those were wonderful framing remarks. A sense of where what we're going to hear about fits in a policy continuum, in a sense, over time. A subject that I know there will be some response from this audience on of the importance of learning, continuous learning and research from a multivariate set of lenses. And then I loved, Assistant Secretary O'Regan, your asking us to think about some of what we hear about inclusive communities in an even broader canvas, in addition to the specific intentional efforts. And Ryan, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Can folks hear me?
I think it's just getting back there to get you.
Great. Thank you, Frank. I'm going to embarrass Mark for a second. This proud father issue. When Mark completed the book, or shortly after, and he got it, he sent me this text.
Oh, that is embarrassing.
which is him with his baby. So I think that's certainly
Nicely played, Ryan.
I must have been out getting formula or something.
That's right. That's right. But I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to join in this conversation, and it's a very important book. In fact, it's the most thorough examination of mixed income development to date, and from a very interesting perspective, not just kind of tracking the evolution of the development and its impacts, but very powerful examination of the lived experience of the residents from all the different income spectrums that now live in those three communities. I'll do just a really brief abridged introduction of the authors. First, Robert Chaskin is professor and deputy dean for strategic initiatives at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration and faculty director of the University of Chicago Urban Network. And Mark Joseph is an associate professor at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western University and founding director of the National Initiative on Mixed Income Communities. But we want to get right to the discussion. And as Frank noted, the first half will be a conversation amongst the three of us. And the second half will be one involving all of you. So tweet, but also think about those questions as we'll transition over after an initial conversation. But just to start, I wanted to ask Rob and Mark, for those who are just getting their copy of the book today, you've heard a little bit about what's in it, but I think it'd be helpful just to provide a general overview of the book and your key findings as well.
So I've created a little Spark notes of the book. I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes just to get you through it, and I'm spending about a minute for every 60 or 70 pages. So if I miss a few things, we'll be able to get back to it in the conversation. But I think actually, Assistant Secretary O'Regan provided a lot of what I would want to say in terms of the basic focus. I will say it's important to know about the Plan for Transformation. Most of you probably do know it. It's the largest effort at reforming public housing in the US. It embraces both mobility strategies, that is moving residents out of large-scale public housing and into presumably better neighborhoods with housing choice vouchers, and development strategies, the demolition of large-scale public housing, and replacing it with mixed-income communities. The scale of this is pretty substantial. About 60% of units have been demolished. About 40% of residents have been moved into, 45% I think, moved into private housing using housing choice vouchers. Another 40% are in traditional housing, and about 11 or 12% of the residents who were relocated by the transformation are in these mixed income communities. So while the mixed income development really drives the lion's share of the transformation, the number of CHA residents that are benefiting from or are moving into these mixed income developments is actually quite small. So we are trying to understand this process as a whole and its impact on the residents who particularly live in these mixed income developments. And as Kathy said, we focused particularly on this idea of integration, that this was an effort both to fix public housing and address concentrated urban poverty, but also to remake urban neighborhoods and revitalize them in ways that would effectively integrate public housing residents and other low-income residents into well-functioning, economically diverse neighborhoods. In focusing on this, we focus on the ideas behind it. Why do we think this is a good idea? What's it supposed to do? What are the strategies that are used to achieve it, and how do they work out? And how does it play out on the ground? How do people, both public housing residents and their neighbors, respond to and experience this transformation? Now we frame this, as was said, both in the context of public housing, of concentrated urban poverty in the U.S. and of public housing reforms over several phases. We also frame it in the context of some of the theoretical frameworks that seem to drive it. Ideas about why neighborhoods are important, ideas about the importance of social interaction and social capital, and how in concentrated urban poverty neighborhoods people have been isolated from that. And to an extent, the ideas behind design, the new urbanist ideas about design, how you can effectively design neighborhoods and the built environment in ways that will foster particular kinds of positive social interaction and build community. We focus on 3 mixed income developments, and we were in the field for 6 years, but I think we were working on this for a good deal longer. And in particular, we look at, again, the nature of social interaction, the factors that determine that social interaction, on the ground, ideas about order and safety, and how the regulatory regimes that are set up within these communities in order to preserve order and maintain safety shape these dynamics, particularly among residents who come from very different backgrounds. And the extent to which these mixed income developments contribute to broader neighborhood development in the areas around around the footprint of the public housing, and the extent to which the developments are integrated into those neighborhoods. So what do we find? Very quickly, we find there are indeed some real benefits. These are much safer neighborhoods. The built environment has been completely transformed. They are, lovely to look at and to walk through. But the broader social goals of integration have been much more elusive. And there's been very little success, very few social network benefits to public housing residents, very little integration into the workforce and workforce opportunities for residents in the mixed income developments. And rather than sort of effective and positive integration within these communities, dynamics of exclusion and stigma have been reproduced and regenerated. So why is this the case? I think there are a few findings on this front. One has to do with sort of an overemphasis or an overly hopeful orientation toward the power of propinquity, of people living spatially next to one another. And this idea that co-location is going to lead to interaction, positive interaction that's going to lead to social capital benefits. There's also, I think, been an overemphasis on behavioral orientations to solving the problems of urban poverty. That is, a lot of emphasis was placed both by developers, by higher income residents within these neighborhoods, an embrace of the idea that middle class people can play a role, can provide kind of role models to poor people who are going to rethink their future aspirations and sort of embrace, normative mainstream values, right? Whereas public housing residents don't see that their values are, fundamentally different than the values of their middle-income neighborhoods. Third, what Kathy also mentioned is that fundamentally the limitations of housing and spatial solutions to what are much more complex social and economic problems. And indeed, the newer sort of iterations of these policies begin to address some of those other dimensions. And finally, I think, is a kind of an excess of faith in market means and market logics and market mechanisms to solve what are, again, very complex social and economic problems. And there may well be places where market interests and public policy interests align. But to assume that they will align, I think, is fundamentally problematic. Okay, finally, then we conclude with some implications. We sketch out some implications both for how to make mixed income public housing redevelopment work better, and talk about things like more clarity and transparency about and communication about these efforts among all those involved. Thinking about ways of modulating social distance. So what you have in the Chicago case anyway are significant distance between the poorest and the most affluent people in these communities. And so one suggestion is if you could modulate that, if you had more price points, smaller and larger units and so forth, you could begin to bridge that distance. More investment in the non-building side of this, in social supports, social services, in economic opportunities, and a rethinking to some extent of the design and rollout of these efforts. That is, the embrace of new urbanist design principles has really been quite partial. It's focused on sort of defensible space more than on civic space and public space. And when you have civic space, you also have regulatory regimes that are constraining the ways in which people use those spaces. So we need to think differently about what neighborhood, public, and common space is and is for. And then we talk finally about some broader implications. The need to go beyond housing policy in order to address the needs of concentrated poverty. Part of this is by providing more affordable housing, which clearly is just desperately needed, without reconcentrating poverty. And so rethinking the potential for scattered site public housing, for example, which seems to at least be less fraught. It's not clear that scattered site public housing residents are very well integrated into the neighborhoods in which they live, but they at least seem to be less fraught and less policed than the populations we looked at. A new look at inclusionary zoning, I think, that makes it more robust, right? That reaches down to lower income levels and is well spread through cities. And coupling affordable housing with community development investments. So in communities that are working class and poor, where affordable housing can be provided, thinking more broadly about community development strategies as well. And then finally, I think focusing on policies that address poverty more head on. That these are housing policies meant to address concentrated urban poverty, but they don't really fundamentally, they aren't really designed to address the underlying constraints and structural determinants of poverty. And so thinking about structural inequalities, about education, about workforce, about criminal justice reform, and about and being explicit, right, about the role of race, the role that race plays in this, at least in cities like Chicago, which underlies a lot of the sort of assumptions behind the policy, but is not very explicit either in the documents that describe it or in the strategies that get embraced. So that's my 5-minute outline.
Great, thanks, Rob. So we'll talk about the relevance of these findings to other contexts and strategies, including choice. But let's stay with specifically these developments and the idea of public housing transformation through mixed-in communities. So Rob, part of what you mentioned there in terms of the findings were essentially the over-reliance on certain principles, or this belief that propinquity, social capital market could dramatically transform outcomes for residents. But I think what would be helpful is to try to separate your view of to what degree those strategies inherently in mixed income development simply don't lead to those results versus in those developments, were there things about how they were designed, managed, developed that, for one, didn't achieve the goals that were planned around integration, and to some degree created new forms of exclusion and stigma than even existed before?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were certainly aspects of the management of these places that contributed to the kinds of disjunctions and tensions we see. I would say that is not, for the most part, these choices were made very much in good faith by professionals who were trying to make these communities work, right? But I think that so one issue I would raise is I'll come back to the issue of sort of the market, right? These are developments that need to turn a profit. They need to attract higher income residents to live there. And so the sort of preferences of the market rate residents drive much of what, drive the preferences of development team actions in terms of this focus on safety and security, which translates to a kind of robust surveillance regime that is targeted to the public housing residents largely. I think underlying all that is something that is not within the hands of these professionals, but is a set of sort of cultural normative narratives, I guess, that are embraced by both residents and higher income people in general about the urban poor, right? So there's this sort of resonance of this idea of a kind of culture of poverty and an urban underclass, and a set of expectations about how people who are, who look like those people, right? Who, how they're going to behave, and that changing that behavior is part of the problem. And the legacy, the legacy of the public housing complexes that were on the footprint of these developments is still felt by these residents who are moving into them. But Mark, you might want to add or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me come at this kind of at 3 levels, because I think there's a level up, Ryan, from how you pose the question, in terms of just a kind of a broader existential question for us as Americans, right? In a rapidly diversifying country and society, which is how do people who have different backgrounds figure out how to live comfortably together? So the book and our interest in mixed income developments is because that gives us, as Kathy was saying, a particular lens, but it's on that bigger question. So each of us can step back and think about our neighborhood and our block and who we interact with and who we don't. And what if some researchers, were able to get a grant to really watch very closely what was happening, who was excluded. So that's the kind of broader storyline that's happening anyway, right? And so it's not like there's something broadly different in that sense, kind of that general challenge. Having said that, in these mixed income transformations, you had one group's turf now completely transformed, and part of the good news is, yes, they're physically transformed, gorgeous places, but this still was a certain place where people had history and tradition and families and so on, and now there's a new group there. So yes, there's an element of this where these public housing transformations bring a certain challenge, and very often we get pushback saying, one of our recommendations is about community building and more attention, more proactivity around that. Well, why would there need to be, no one comes into my neighborhood and kind of organizes the neighborhoods and makes us connect and feel good about each other. But our point is these are very particular places, right? There was an intentionality around the mixing, and so there needs to be equally an intentionality about that next step. I like to refer to it as activating the mix. It's one thing to build the mix, and I still think that needs to be an important component of policy, but then it's not enough, as Rob said, just to have the propinquity. It's also what's the next step that happens. But finally, there are actions, I would say, and Rob, you kind of nodded at this. I'll give you one specific example, at least for time. So of actions that were taken that were not helpful, that in fact were harmful. So a property manager in one particular development who gave welcome baskets to the condo owners when they moved in. She had worked in kind of the market rate environment, and it's just natural to her this would be a great thing to do. But did not cross her mind for a second to put welcome baskets for the returning public housing residents. And it just was not something she thought of. She was just somehow acting out. Like when she told us this story, it wasn't like she was embarrassed or ashamed or anything until we started kind of probing a little bit about, wait a second, one group gets a welcome basket, one group doesn't get a welcome basket. Help us understand what's going on there. Right. And we can kind of go on and on like that. So I think what we're calling for in terms of recommendations is, again, far more intentionality about the next step that comes after having created the mix as a platform.
Sure. Well, and I think as you note, I mean, this situation is inherently highly contrived. And I thought another interesting dimension was, in many cases, these weren't marketed as mixed income communities, to the point where buyers weren't even kind of aware of the strategy, right?
Well, it differed. I mean, what's fascinating about this mixed income space is there's so many different experiments out there, right, with this, quote unquote. So at our center at Case Western, we've now identified 300 across the country. And many, many, many developers, some who've been at it a very long time, others who are just getting into it. So you almost have as many approaches to this. And in our book, we have 3 different case studies and 3 different developers. But they really, on this question of to tell or not to tell, take different stances. And you have those who are very upfront and say, we really want to make sure that folks coming into the community know what they're getting into. And so it behooves us to say upfront, this is a mixed income community, used to be public housing, there's going to be a mix. But you absolutely have others, and we don't know, but maybe I would guess the majority, who say, you know what, that's not helping me in my marketing of this development. And so I need to get people here, and then they'll figure it out over time. I think where we end up is that's kind of the wrong way to go. Given the work that it takes on all parts to have a successful mixed income development, you want folks who are coming in knowing what they're getting into.
So the time period that the book studies, it's the previous 9 years, not counting kind of some time they generate the book. Of course, Hope 6 predates it, but all still relatively new in some ways. And just wondering your thoughts on what element does time play in these goals around integration? Simply that in terms of integration among residents, that this might play out more for kids who grew up in these communities. You mentioned some different dimensions of how much the actual development is seen as part of the neighborhood, how much neighbors and residents interact in the broader community. Any thoughts to just, simply it takes longer time for something that is kind of formed and, all at once in a pretty dramatic way?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly possible that over time some of these dynamics will resolve themselves in positive ways. There are a few challenges, though. One is that, when people have negative experiences with one another, right? Then over time they tend to ossify, and so what we found over the course of 6 years anyway, these tensions were sort of becoming entrenched, right? Now it's true, kids are growing up, and there was always a lot of hope, right, for kids as being a kind of point where these connections can be effectively made, and that may yet happen. But there are a few challenges there. First of all, the demographics are a bit challenging. So market rate homeowners tend to have fewer kids and younger kids than public housing residents. Kids don't share much of the same space. They don't go to the same schools. They don't use the same neighborhood amenities. And there's a certain amount of family management strategizing that goes on, at least again over the course of our research, that has kept kids from these different sort of housing backgrounds from each other. So people talk about, public housing residents talk about how, when they send their kids out to play in the play lot, no market rate, no white kids and no market rate kids come out, right? And others, market rate residents, talk about how, there's a bit of an irony here, right? Because on the one hand, public housing residents now feel free to send their kids out to play, right, in these much safer neighborhoods and these much more beautiful surroundings. But the new residents who are coming from other places find these feel that these are not as safe. These may not be safe neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So they talk about how kids are outside, they're running wild, they're not supervised, and I want to keep my kids back from them. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to work out on that front, I think, and there may be some real keys in terms of the role of schools and the role of community-based organizations in helping to facilitate these bridges.
Can I jump in on this? So I want to quickly go in a couple directions. One is we got to ask residents themselves a version of your question. So we did these 16, in addition to the interviews that Rob mentioned, which we got to go back and have repeated conversations. So we went back to folks over time. And I don't know, this might be broad generalization, but my sense is that early conversation, there was particularly among the relocated public housing residents, the pride at showing you their unit, right? And literally wanting to walk you around and show you the bathroom and this and everything and look at my new home. And even in that first conversation, then some sense of an edge to what they were experiencing. But I think, as Rob said, what we saw over time, you go back to the next conversation and they start to talk about the community meeting that they went to where they felt stigmatized, or conversations they had with their neighbors that made them feel uncomfortable. What I wanted to reference was the focus groups that we did. And in our third wave of data collection, we did, I think it was 16 focus groups across the 3 developments with folks in affinity groups. So we had the public housing relocated residents together, we had market rate residents together, renters, owners. And we asked a version toward the end of the conversation about, I think did we end up using that kind of time capsule? If you come back in 20, 25 years,
exactly.
What do you expect to see? So what do you think if you fast forward the time question? And for me, it was one of the more sobering parts of, in fact, this entire study. I really kind of sucked us. Just the kind of pessimism that folks felt about where this was going. And really across the board. Now, in 2 different directions.
Yeah.
No one seemed to think, very, very few, that it would remain a stable mixed income development. They all thought it was going one way or the other way, depending on who they were, their point of view. Either they thought, this is just a first step toward gentrification. Again, back to Kathy's point, which really connects us to this broader, everyone's feeling the gentrification pressure and just saying, is this just a version of this? So either it's going to gentrify and we won't be here anymore, or this was a chance for the white folks to get in and they're kind of putting us up with us for now. And in fact, if kind of behavior stays the way it is by some of my neighbors, they're not going to put up with this for very long. Or those who felt it actually was going to cycle back and kind of resegregate, reconcentrate. And this is a good segue to very quick other point I wanted to make in terms of time. Back to Kathy, if you laid out kind of that process, kind of 2000 all the way through whatever, today, but 2007, 2008, housing market crash, right? Which is a massive part of the story in Chicago and across the country in terms of these efforts, but particularly in Chicago, and this goes to Rob's point about linking the provision of social housing to the market. Because Chicago went all in on that. And by all in, I mean not only did they have a heavy portion that was market rate, but heavy ownership portion. And stepping outside of Chicago to some other place around the country, you don't often see that level of commitment to having a for sale component in it. But Chicago really believed that A, pre-2007 they had the market for it. B, back to the concept that getting owners into this space was an important part of the mix, so having mixed tenure as well as mixed income. So he had this commitment, and then the market crash hits, and it does a couple things. One, it freezes for sale production. So we have kind of graphs in the book that really show this, but where you see the rental units continuing to be placed, I guess for you guys it would be this way, the for sale just flatlines till today. And there still aren't units being produced even a few years out, so it's going to be a while. And you can look at this in other cities as well. San Francisco, similar case, where the for sale component that was planned is really put on hold. But secondly, and I think this goes a little bit to your question, Ryan, is the attitudes of residents changed. And in particular, I mean attitudes of owners changed post-recession. Because all of a sudden there were these increasing concerns, whereas pre-2008 they'd looked at other emerging neighborhoods in the city where those investments were risky but were wise. You could see the prices climbing. You could see where this is going. And all of a sudden there was this fear about what have we done, where have we invested? And so suddenly when they're in that community meeting, there's a little more harshness and pointedness around what's not happening in this community and where we need the security and where I'm unhappy with my neighbor. The good news, and there was a silver lining, I think, to the recession, which was those unhappy owners were now stuck. And I think there really was a moment where if they could have sold and moved on, they would have, but we saw literally, can give you anecdotes about owners who are like, well, you know what, if I'm going to be here, I need to dig in. And I need to get a little bit more involved. Now, their involvement was with a certain level of attitude, but at least they were getting outside of their door and getting out to the community meeting, getting the community policing meeting. So this question of time, very, very important, but I think it gives us a insight into this question of the market as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I want to just emphasize this last point, Mark, that this is a double edge, right? That homeowners' involvement in the context of we're stuck and we got to make this work, in some cases have been quite positive and really has been around community building around, for example, community garden that has in fact brought in a broad range of residents. But in other cases, it's been really punitive, and it's about really, again, shutting down the public housing residents. And just to clarify, when we talk about concerns about safety and security, these are very clearly stated by developers and by homeowners, and frankly by everybody. Everybody cares about safety and security, right? But the actual complaints that generate responses of surveillance and monitoring and 3-strike rules and threats of eviction are not, for the most part, about crime. They're about kind of incivilities. They're about noise on the street or barbecuing or hanging clothes right on balconies. And so there's a real disjunction between a set of ideas about what neighborhood life should look like and what public space is and what should be kept in private. So that's an important, I think, thing to understand.
Well, I think it's that reinforcing that narrative of the urban underclass
Exactly.
you mentioned. And I think it is interesting that kind of the market tanking on some level. You wonder this idea of kind of people are there. If it was a strong market and people saw values increase and some degree of movement in sales, you wonder if people would project less the fact that their values are stuck to behavior and other folks. So one more question, then we'll open to the audience, and it's around efforts beyond Chicago. So 2 parts. One is first just with your observations of choice neighborhoods and its evolution and all the conscious learning. What have you seen, whether it's choice or other mixed income strategies since Chicago started that you'd want to share that might have approached things differently? And then just more generally with most of the current prominent housing policies and strategies, beyond choice, still are incorporating some dimension of income integration involvement of the private sector, be that residential mobility programs, inclusionary zoning. So just wondering anything in your work or your findings that you find relevant just to these types of market and integration strategies generally.
So maybe I can start with choice and other developments, and then Rob can jump in. No, this is a vibrant landscape. I mean, so I have a Google alert for mixed income, and literally each week you hear about another city launching a mixed income development. So, across the country, and as we mentioned in the book, this is an international phenomenon as well. Yeah. So other countries around the world really working with intentional planned mixed income integration. Kathy mentioned choice, and I actually was able to be on the evaluation team as part of the Urban Institute's team for the evaluation of the first 5 implementation grantees, the evaluation of that. So I was able to see kind of those early days of those folks grappling with choice. So choice, is this administration's kind of Hope 6 on steroids, right? It just blows it out to a whole nother level. I think conceptually for exactly the right reasons, where Hope 6 was constrained in really focusing on the site itself and primarily the housing redevelopment. And so coming out of that, realizing this has really got to be a neighborhood focus. So that's what choice does. It takes it to the level of neighborhood. And then we've got to think about the other components. And so schools and education, for example, being a key part of choice. Workforce strategies being a key part of choice. So I think that's all been to the good. What we've watched, though, is then these development partnerships grapple with the weight of implementing one of those strategies and trying to pull together the multiplicity of actors that you need to locally. I think one of the challenges with choice, and if I had to say kind of next phase policy-wise for it, is there are these 3 clear pillars of choice: people, housing, and neighborhood. And people was ramped up as well because of disappointments in Hope 6. So I think the pillars are very clear, and we've watched cities grapple with and housing authorities grapple with those. I think what's not as clear is how you integrate them, and they still remain siloed in a way. There's often a people lead and a housing lead and a neighborhood lead, and in fact, I think the NOFA, right, Notice of Funding Availability, where HUD gets it all started, is a key place for intervention. And I think there's room to think about the NOFAs because that really guides, and we've watched enough cities now sit down and look at it page by page and figure out, okay, we have to do this, we have to think about that. So it's a great place to guide action. I think there could be a lot more it almost guides action toward the silos. Pick your lead in that area and figure out your strategy in that area, and you guys go off and meet and figure out the housing stuff and the neighborhood stuff and the people stuff. I think there's also a missing pillar, and for me, it's community. And I think there may have been a thought that neighborhood kind of had community in it, but neighborhood here is really a geographic construct with some social in it. I think there needs to be a pillar around the social side of community. And given all the questions coming out from our research and the research of others in this area, to encourage local actors to really think hard about the social questions that cut across the people, housing, and neighborhood parts. One last thought on choice, it ramps up the degree of which the kind of actors that have to get involved. So you're seeing universities involved in different ways, and as we mentioned, schools and other actors. But how do you make that infrastructure work in a coordinated way? And sometimes you'll see a developer take the lead, sometimes you'll see a housing authority take the lead, sometimes you'll see a city mayor's office take the lead. I think that what we're seeing from the early years of choice is that where City Hall really is able to step up and take this on, appoint a key player who's clearly the point person for this, and I'm going to call you out, Angie, because we're looking at one example right here who is an awesome example. Angie Rogers leads the New Communities Initiative here in DC. If you don't know about New Communities Initiative, you should Google it. If you've heard of it as of 5 years ago, take another look, because it's really being turned around under this mayor and under Angie's leadership. But where there is a point person at City Hall who can kind of pull all these other disparate actors together, it's very hard for housing authorities to do that kind of brokering and convening that needs to happen for a kind of comprehensive initiative like choice. So I think the cities have a key role in it.
I might add a little bit to Mark's 4th pillar, which is, I think, implied in what he's talking about when he talks about community, and that has to do with the process of how decisions get made and the nature of deliberation about what kind of communities these are going to be. Because often what we have found is this sort of exclusion of public housing and other poor residents in the decision-making deliberation about what norms are, what is appropriate behavior, what parks are for, and so forth, is part of what underlies these sort of negative dynamics. And the second thing I would say about choice and all sort of comprehensive community initiatives, right, is that neighborhoods are clearly critical, and making those links and integrating those strategies, as difficult it is very important. But neighborhoods also sit within broader systems, and so thinking about how to link those neighborhoods and the people within them to the city and the metropolitan region more broadly, I think, is essential, because poverty and is neither created nor reproduced at the neighborhood level, right? It happens at other levels. So you need to think about operating at those other levels. As to the some of these other mechanisms you talked about, I think these are very much worth thinking about. I think the sort of mobility programs, in moving public housing residents out of concentrated poverty neighborhoods and then into other neighborhoods have, in Chicago and in many parts of the city, have largely led to a kind of reconcentration in better neighborhoods, but still pretty poor neighborhoods, and largely African American neighborhoods. So in Chicago, public housing residents who moved with vouchers to the private market are actually in more highly segregated neighborhoods than those who are living in mixed income or in traditional public housing. So I think there needs to be stuff attached to that, right? We've also found that housing choice voucher families in Chicago are some of the more challenged households of any of those who went down any path in Chicago. So they tend to be larger families. Because they are of their mobility, they have largely disconnected from kind of services and support. So we need to ramp up how we support, both in terms of mobility counseling, but also other kinds of social services and supports to those families. Inclusionary zoning, I think, is really important. I think as I said earlier, I think we need to think about whether we can make it somewhat more robust, right? The area median income sort of threshold means that most really poor people are not going to benefit from these schemes. And in Chicago, anyway, there's an out for developers. They can pay into a fund to support low-income housing, and that can just lead to, again, more or new forms of segregation. But I think those are things. Those are mechanisms that both of those have value, and we should think about how to make them better.
Just 3 quick points. I know we want to open up on IZ. I think that's the next frontier in our country for serious mixed income development, and by serious I mean that sees this policy not just as about affordable housing production, but also looks at the potential social impacts. And I think that's completely missing from the IZ discussion. Is there a social impact from that, and how would we measure it? How would we know? You talk about going from our work in Chicago broadly. I want to debunk a pushback that we often get, which is, well, this is Chicago, right? This was a Chicago story, and Chicago is very different in certain ways. And yes, there are some realities there. But one of the first things I wanted to do, we launched some of you know, a national initiative on mixed income communities at CASE, and we did a scan of the field. So we looked at 30 mixed income developments on the subject of social dynamics, just to see, was this just a Chicago thing? And when we asked these folks in other cities, would they say, oh, we've got it figured out, harmonious across incomes and tenure and whatever? Definitely not the case. So many of these themes relate. And this kind of links the 2 points. New York City, as many of you are aware, under de Blasio, now has kind of the most pioneering IZ program in the nation, and we should all pay very close attention to it. But there's a sense in which, when I talk to the New York folks, and we just had a conference call with them this week, there's this New York exceptionalism. That we're going to figure it out. There's got to be a New York solution to these New York issues. Our housing authorities like none other. These issues are like none other. And what we say to them is, again, yeah, there are some very particular differences, but there's a whole field of experience on this mixed income work that you could really both learn from and add to in interesting ways. We're kind of appealing for New York to see itself in the context, in this national context, as opposed to what seems to be a very New York focused approach.
Well, I agree. I think in some ways it has to be, one of the big frontiers simply just to achieve something at scale. And I think there's a lot in the book that can be relevant, because my concern is if you go to a deeper degree of affordability, simply the orientation of those communities, the risk for even deeper isolation and stigma is severe if there isn't, I think, enough planning. I just know in a personal experience, inclusionary zoning that actually was set aside for folks with severe disabilities was actually quite successful, because it was paired with such robust services and other things. So we want to open up to the audience for Q&A. And I think we have a few mics available because this is being recorded, so great. So yes, and just state your name and your affiliation before the question, please.
I'm Greg Squires, Chair of the Sociology Department at George Washington. I'm from Cleveland. I served on the Woodstock Institute with Rob, and my daughter was a student of Kathleen's, even though she doesn't remember many years ago.
I do.
And you mentioned evicted earlier, and Desmond talks about housing as a right. And this is something that Chester Hartman and a handful of other people have been talking about for many years, and this concept has been broadened to the notion of a right to the city. There's a right to the city alliance right now. And I'd like to ask if you gave any thought to this way of framing these issues, and if so, what might be some of the policy implications? And I'm thinking in particular of to what extent are these issues market phenomenon that should be played out within the context of market forces, and to what extent should we simply say, no, that's simply the wrong way of framing these issues. This is a right, and from my perspective, that suggests very different sets of ways of understanding and responding to these issues.
I think it's a really great question, and it was obviously not a major framing of our work. Though we did think about sort of the right to the city arguments as a way of framing the kind of dynamics of exclusion with first of all the argument for right mixed income public housing redevelopment is about establishing a right to the city that public housing residents have been excluded from the access to the opportunities and the life and the embrace of what cities provide beyond a livelihood, right? These are places that we live, we use, we have families, we engage with our neighbors, and there are some who suggest that this is what it's about. It's about embracing the right to the city, and by encouraging diversity and access and inclusion, you're going to get there. But in fact, the dynamics we see are very much in opposition to that notion. I think that I think it's a really important framework. Rights are hard, right? Rights are always contested. There is no sort of consensus that housing is a right in the United States. We as a country engage in rights talk all over the place and help shape rights, treaties that we may or may not sign, or may sign but may or may not ratify, right? And we tend to be much more. It tends to be a hard line to sell. I think it's I think it's something that we should be pushing on and thinking about.
I think certainly right to housing, kind of in a broader framing, may not have been driving, but as Rob's answer already shows you, right to the city was very much something we'd already written about along the way and used in the book. And then this whole issue of relocation rights. So it might not be right to housing broadly construed, but right to this housing, right? Who has a right to this housing was very much clearly up front. When we started the book, there were 2 lawsuits going on in Chicago around the relocation rights issue and how residents were being informed, being supported, and so on. And it was a relocation rights agreement, which we then, when we started working with Angie, looked into a little bit more to see who else around the city has those. And it turns out Chicago has the most robust citywide relocation rights agreement, right? Hashed out over years and agreed to, and then very much driving all the way down to micro decisions from the point, sometimes to the chagrin of developers who exhaust the number of public housing residents who want to return or are able to return, have a huge wait list of others to get in, but because the agreement can't make that move, and so you literally had units sitting empty for up to a year in some cases because they couldn't. So that whole rights piece was clearly a component of it, and I do think, in a way, your question is a really helpful one, linking kind of right to housing, right to this housing, and right to the city, and to be a citizen of a city, and what does that mean? More thinking about how those connect, I think could be extremely useful.
Although I would add, the distinction between the relocation rights, argument, advocacy, and ultimately agreement, and a right to housing, there's significant real estate if you'll forgive the pun, but between those two things. Because, the Housing Authority has responsibility for leaseholders in these units. The people who, the residents of those units are often, include many other people who are housing unstable and who move from place to place, from friend to friend, from family to family. There's no fundamental, we don't embrace a fundamental right that every American ought to have, safe, affordable, sanitary housing. And I think that's a different framework.
And very quickly, we need to be able to hold two things in our heads at once with this policy and practice, and that is the importance of housing as a platform, but the reality of housing is not enough.
Yeah.
And I worry that if this gets overly framed as right to housing, we lose all these broader issues of just rights to be engaged and a citizen and respected in a certain way, more broadly than you're in a unit and you can live there, right? So it's both of those sides.
Right. So, sir, and then we'll go to the front here.
Okay, so I will not introduce myself as HUD, Director of Hope 6 Community and Supportive Services. I'm not introducing myself that
Well
way.
done.
I have two
You didn't tell us
small.
your name.
Ron Ashford. Two questions. One, you talked about 300 sites across the country where mixed income is happening. I want to know, where is it working well? What are the ingredients that go into making it work well, right? And then the other is moving to opportunity. So 15, 20 years later, it turns out that the kids who move to those new neighborhoods are doing phenomenally better. Are we going to see this phenomena with the kids who are living in the mixed income developments?
All right, great questions. So where's it working well? So there's one place where it's working perfectly, but they said I could not give out their address because they didn't want everyone to come. No, so we often get them.
That's not true?
So some of you have heard me talk before, and I've got a 5-part success framework. Like, what does success even mean? What does working well even mean, right? And you talked about the multiplicity of goals. I think it's one of the problems here, and part of what we did is talk to hundreds of people from different roles. What would success look like? And we got a bunch of different answers. So as Rob mentioned, and you might have missed it in passing, step number 1 is, with your development partnership, agree on what the goals are. And the goals should not necessarily be the same in every place, because it depends on your context, your neighborhood, your city, who your developer is, who your property manager is. So that's a whole other strand that we can come back to. But success includes creating a mixed income occupancy. It includes improving quality of life. It includes could include, I should say, building community in addition to just building housing. It could include economic mobility for the individuals. I have some fierce debates with my academic colleagues whether that should be a part of this. Is it just about getting quality, affordable housing, or is it about economic mobility? And finally, it could include the neighborhood change, as well as just the development. So success can be all those things. To your question, Ron, I personally, and looking at the 300, I don't see anyone who's nailing all 5. But now, there could be many out there who say, Mark, we're not going for all 5, right? Our job and our contract and our MOU says build this housing, get these people in there, and move on, put some property management in place. I think for the millions that we're investing, and for the opportunity cost, and it's the point we make in the book, is you got to say what else could have been done, right? That we need to hold this to the highest possible standard. We need to maximize everything we can get out of these places, and I personally believe we can. I think with smarter, more tactical, strategic work, we can get far more out of the investment than we're getting, even more than the wins. And yes, there are the wins, but we can get more wins. So I think there are places that are doing, and actually we're going to put it up on our website soon, we've got a list of exemplary developments by category. So we think there's some that are doing really cool stuff around youth. We think there's some that are doing really cool stuff around property management. Some are doing really cool community building. I don't know that anyone's put the packet together yet. Your second question is MTO, so lots to say about that. Do you want to jump in? All right.
Go ahead. I have 2 things to say about it, but you're going to say them.
So, yeah, I mean, it's an amazing phenomenon, right? So for those who don't know, Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren and Larry Katz wrote a paper about MTO that it's just one of these phenomena, right, where academics and scholarship jumps over. And I think it's partly because there was so much disappointment with MTO, even though there were some good things about it. But ultimately, we weren't seeing the results in terms of economic mobility that we had hoped for. So along comes this research that's able to use tax returns to look at the kids years later and starts to see that, as you said, the kids are doing well. Now, 2 caveats, and then maybe I'll toss to you. Or maybe I'll steal your caveats,
yeah, exactly.
and then I'll toss to you. One is you said splendidly better, you said tremendously better, or something hugely better.
Yeah.
It wasn't that, I mean, it was that, yes, better, and significant, statistically significant, but in a lot of cases, still in poverty, right? If you look at the levels that they're living at. Now, I was looking at the paper again, I think they make a good point. If you add it up over time, kind of lifetime career impact, you start to get to some numbers, and certainly if you add it up across. But it's not like there was this massive change. Secondly, and this is critical, it was kids who moved before they were 13. Right? And part of what we've been learning from MTO is the challenges, particularly for boys who are older. And so we've got to be really, really careful and work with that nuance, right? So yes, younger kids, but their older siblings, and in fact, they say in their paper, not only did they not show, improvement, it may have hurt. They show some negative results for the older kids. So what do we do with that? You got a family with younger kids and older kids. What choice are you making? So I think part of the recommendation is we've got to be really exquisitely focused and skilled in our relocation counseling. To help families think through the choices they're making and whether to do a mobility effort or place-based. Maybe, I don't know if they'll be helpful, but by way of segue, I think the challenge is that research was around mobility out of public housing into another community. What we're talking about in this part of policy is around revitalizing an area and keeping people in it. And so yes, we think that mix should be positive, but we need the same kind of detailed study over a period of time, back to your point, to really be able to tell that story. It's a different policy approach than the one that was shown in that book.
Yeah, what he said. I mean, I guess I would add 2 things. One is, back to the point about, statistically significant, but not fundamentally changed life course trajectories. We don't know very much. We don't really know anything about this sort of, or we don't know very much about this sort of the social impacts. Right. This is back to the point you made earlier. What are the lives of these kids like in these places, and what are the benefits? More and more understanding what the benefits are and what the challenges are and how those work. And I think we do need to understand. We understand that. The second thing I want to say is that, and this is back to the point of younger versus older kids. It's just a caution, I guess, that between sort of those findings and, for example, James Heckman's findings about how investment in the early few years leads to incredible benefits down the line, I worry that we are poised to give up on teenagers and older kids. They're hard, we don't, they're expensive, they're often seen as problematic. So you've got the sort of, this dynamic of children younger children sort of as victims that we want to save, and older children as risks that we have to contain. And I just think we have to think about youth when we think about these different interventions, and look for more than the data point that suggests, sufficient success to run with, right? The other danger is we go, great, let's do this, right? And we give up on public housing for public housing's sake, on community development in neighborhoods that can be developed, on youth development for older kids. And so just a bit of caution in how we read these findings would be.
Very quickly to that point, and this will give you a little something to walk away with on the youth point. Our next scan of the field out of our national initiative is going to be on the subject of youth in mixed-income developments, because we have a paper on that. We agree it should be the best news out of mixed-income developments is what's happening with kids, and therefore it's tragic that at least what we're seeing is youth as flashpoints for friction and more that you can read in the book. So we're doing a scan. We're going to have 4 exemplary places to look at around youth, and we know what 2 of them are going to be. One of them, if you don't know about Regent Park in Toronto, it's actually going to be the world's largest, or at least the country's, well, not the country, but North America's largest mixed-income development, 7,000 units when it's all said and done. They have a very cool older youth program with youth as ambassadors, a lot of positive youth development stuff going on. And the other storyline was Park Boulevard in Chicago. Also had a very, very strong youth development approach, so we're going to put case studies of that and make those available.
So I'm sorry I can't call on the rest of you raise your hand because we do need time for people to get those lovely books and have them signed. So we're going to close, but Kathy, want to provide an opportunity for any reflections from this discussion?
I'm going to do something really obnoxious. This isn't even reflections in some with you all. This is a pet peeve of mine, so I'm going to end on it. Returning to the Chetty work. So one of the comments I made was that we need to apply our research more broadly.
Come on, why don't you? Yes, go, yes.
Okay, pet peeve for all of you. Apply our research more broadly, right? Take lessons more broadly than the specific context of the study. And the Chetty work uses MTO where the mobility is a great design feature to control for selection, so that we know what the causal mechanism is. But the lesson isn't so then everybody has to move. The lesson is about the power of place. The critical importance for the housing and neighborhood for the trajectory of these kids. One way to possibly get there is mobility, with caveats. Another critical way is the places ought to support healthy development for our families, and we need to invest in those. So HUD is interpreting the work as about the power of place, not as only support for mobility strategies.
It's a very important. It's a very important clarification. The last thing I note is that, when I was speaking to Mark and Rob before, I asked this question: what's the punchline? And in some ways there are many punchlines. Certainly, one is that it's hard, but to some degree, I think where the field has come. The fact that we're talking about the importance of integration and how hard it is to get that right means that in many ways, through Hope 6 and others, we've kind of answered that first question: can you redevelop public housing in a way that is lower density, that is tied to a neighborhood? And secondly, can you provide housing for people of different incomes and will they simply be willing to even live there? And the fact that those have been answered affirmatively, I think, shows why there is so much promise. At the same time, the importance of now really going deep and taking seriously these next important issues around integration and connection to really continue to advance this work. So I think we're turning it to Frank to wrap up here.
While Frank's coming up, I just want to give a plug. If you haven't seen the latest Shelter Force issue, which is all on mixed income, it's excellent. So just a plug.
I will just make a couple of quick closing comments, and then we will welcome you all to return to the reception and some book signing. Just 3 quick points out of this. One, the power of the research that was done here, and Kathy's call for more of this type of evidence that goes beyond what works, that is complex, multifaceted, and talks about what works for whom and why from many different methods. I think we see the power of that in the conversation. Second, I stopped writing all the notes because I realized I could look at the video. The tremendous suggestions for what next. I hope the book spurs the kind of conversations about how do we get better at getting better at this work, and we heard a number of powerful suggestions. And third, I think we would all be remiss if we did not thank, I'm going to thank all the participants in a minute, but if we did not thank the people in this administration who have led on this, and with I'd suggest a more powerful vision, a more thoroughly applied vision, and I won't call out everybody here today. I would call out the leadership at HUD and Mindy Turboff, who leads Choice and her team for just deep work. So I'd ask you to thank them as the first people to thank. I want to thank, and with admiration and thanks for many things actually over the years, to our authors for their depth of scholarship and public policy mindedness. So a round of applause for them. For everybody else who helped put this together, to Ryan, to Kathy, and to Gina Cheney, who just came into the back room, who actually organized all of this. Thank you all. We conclude, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the next room. Great.